Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today we have a great video. We're going to be wrapping up everything that I read in the month of January. So let's go ahead and get started. January was a pretty fruitful reading month for me. I read 11 books, although 3 of those were picture books, so I'm not sure they really count, but in total we have 11. The first we have is Wildfire, Wildflower Falls by Denise Hunter. I was supposed to read it back in November as part of my readathon, but then I replaced it with a different option. But I still wanted to give it a chance, so I read it at the beginning of January. And I ended up quite liking it. It was my first Denise Hunter book, and I was a little wary because I had heard some mixed reviews about the first book in that series. So I wasn't really interested in reading the first book. And this is the third book in the series, I believe. Could be the fourth. It might be the fourth. Because they follow different members of a family. And I think that there are 3 characters before. Yeah. So it must be the fourth then. So I read the fourth book in the series, and I haven't read any of the others, but I personally felt that it could be read okay as a standalone. I mean, it definitely referenced other characters in the series and other storylines, and I know other romances, so it definitely would spoil it to read it as a standalone rather than in a part of a series, but I didn't necessarily feel like I was missing that much information. I felt like it kind of explained what it needed to explain for the storyline. So I did not feel like I was missing anything by not reading the first 3 books. And I may go back and read one of the other books in the series because one of the other couples in the book did intrigue me and I wanted to know their story. But the other 2 storylines didn't really interest me that much. The first storyline in the series doesn't really interest me because from what I've heard from other people, it involves kind of a love triangle and I'm not really into that. So I probably won't be reading the first, but I might read the third. I don't know. We'll see. But I did give this one 4 stars, and I really enjoyed it. And I will definitely give some more tries to Denise Hunter because I think this one turned out well. The next book that I read is Heart of the Mountains by Basham. And what can I say? It was really good. I gave this one 4 stars as well. It kind of follows Laurel's dream. The characters in each of these books are siblings, and it takes place after the event of Laurel's dream, but I did not realize this. I thought that they were both standalone, so I read this one first. But that was okay. I wouldn't recommend it. Unlike Wildflower Falls, I felt like these were even more tied together than that, and so I wouldn't recommend reading them out of order, but it wasn't necessarily bad. It was okay. But yeah, I really liked it. There is a young English woman who wants to escape a marriage arranged by her father, so she goes to the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina to meet up with her brother, who is serving as a missionary teacher and doctor there. And while there, she meets a young man who happens to be the brother of her brother's wife. So there's that. And yeah, it's really good. And I gave it 4 stars. I would definitely recommend it. It takes place right after World War I. So early, 1919 to 1920, around that time. The next book I read is also Basham, and it is Loyally Luke, which this book does not actually come out till May, but I am on Basham's launch team, so I got an e-copy of it, and it was fantastic. I gave it 5 stars, and I gave it 5 stars and a little extra caveat because even though it's only January, I have a feeling that Loyally Luke will be in the running for my top 10 books of 2024. It was that good. It was so fantastic. And I don't want to spoil too much because it does come out in May, and I do want you guys all to read it. But it is the 3rd book in the Edgewood Siblings series. And again, I don't think they're technically qualified as a series. Like if you look online, they're not really listed as a series, but they definitely are because, well, they follow the different siblings. And so you had Authentically Izzy first, and then Positively Penelope, and now you have Loyally Luke. And it's just, there's romance, there's humor, there's heart, and there's like a depth to the storylines and they deal with issues that most like light romances kind of overlook. Like it has all the characteristics of a light romance, yet it still hits those deep topics. Like Pepper Basham does that so well with these books, with all three of these books, weaving in the light, fun romance with the deeper topics while not weighing the reader down. It's so good. I could gush about it for a while. And I will probably do a video just on Loyally Luke. Well, maybe not. I don't know how much I could say without spoiling. And I don't really want to spoil since it doesn't come out for a few more months. So I probably won't do a video about it especially, but I could. I could gush for an entire video about it. It's so good, and I definitely recommend it. If you haven't pre-ordered it, I would recommend pre-ordering it or getting it when it comes out in May. If you haven't read Authentically Izzy or Positively Penelope, I definitely recommend reading those to hype you up for Loyally Luke. It was just so good. When I first read Authentically Izzy and I saw Luke as a character, I was like, wow. He was like my favorite character in Authentically Izzy, even though we didn't really see him that much. And I was like, man, I'd love it if he got his own story. And then when I found out he was getting his own story, I was like ready. I was like, I'm so looking forward to this. I can't wait for his own story to come out. And it did not disappoint me. It was so good. And I really think that it might be a contender for my top 10 2024. Of course, we have 11 more months to go, so I can't say for sure. But it's on the list to be in the running for sure. So after Loyally Luke, I read A Seaside Wonder by Melissa Tagg, which I also gave 5 stars, and it was really good. I read the first book in the Muir Harbor series back in November, which was Autumn by the Sea, and I only gave it 4 stars, and I was like, well, I liked it, and I want to continue the series, but, you know, we'll see how it goes. Like, I didn't absolutely love it, but I liked it enough to want to continue the series, and I'm so glad I did, because both of the books, the next 2 books that I read this month, were 5 stars for me. A Seaside Wonder, again, it kind of caught you off guard because, you know, it came in being like, we're going to be at this light romance, this fun romance, but then it really hit some deep topics that, I mean, they were really good. The female main character goes through some stuff that I did not expect. Like that I had no idea what it's going to be there when I started into the book, but it was done so well. And the male character was just, I loved him. And he's dealing with being the guardian of his younger sister for the past few months. And that's a really interesting storyline. And their storyline together is just really good. I'm trying to get better at not spoiling things in my videos because I feel like sometimes I let things slip in here. So I'm trying to explain to you how much I liked it without giving too much away. But I'll just say it was 5 stars and I really, really enjoyed it. Then I read the 3rd book in the series, which is Wedding at Sea by Melissa Tagg. I also gave this one 5 stars. But like Loyally Luke, I put a little asterisk next to it because it could also be in the running for top 10 this year. It was just so good. So throughout the Muir Harbor series, there's kind of a mystery about a missing granddaughter. So there's the matriarch of the Muir family, Maggie Muir, and she has, they're young enough to be her grandkids, but she calls them her children because she adopted them throughout the years. And each book follows one of those 3 kids that she has adopted. But she also has a granddaughter that has been missing all these years. And so that's been kind of a mystery through the first 3 books. In the 3rd book, the main guy in the 3rd book is the young private detective who is investigating the case of the missing granddaughter. He kind of inherited the case from his father, who was also a private detective investigator. And So the mystery plays a big part in this third book, and I have to say, it took me down a lot of paths. Now, I have been writing from a young age myself, so I'm a writer, although I'm not published, so... but I am a writer, and I do have a master's degree in editing and in publishing and writing, and so books are a big part of my world, both writing and editing and reading and everything. And so for me, having been involved in so many aspects of books, I don't tend to be surprised a lot. I can usually guess pretty early on how a book is going to end. And, well, obviously with romances, we all know how they're going to end. But I mean, like, if there's, like, a mystery or something, I can usually guess pretty early on and pick up on the foreshadowing and how things are going to end. And with this one, I did the way it ended, the way the mystery turned out, I did briefly think about that one, but that's not the one that I really settled on. Like, I had a few different options in my head as I was reading along, and the true option is not the one I settled on, which is very unusual for me. So I was very, very impressed with the mystery storyline. And so, yeah, I had to give it props for that, because I am not easily surprised. And so when it actually came about, I was like, oh, I thought about that, but then I didn't choose that one. And so, yeah, I was very, very pleasantly surprised and impressed that they got me on that one. So, yeah. So that's what I'll say on that without spoiling anything. But yeah, it was really, really good. So the next book, which I actually finished in between the two Melissa Taggs, was The Watchmaker's Daughter by Larry Loftis. And this was a nonfiction, because I did want to read more nonfiction this year, so this is my first nonfiction of the year. It is a biography on Corrie ten Boom and her resistance work, her Dutch resistance work during World War II. And I gave it 5 stars. It was so excellent. If you are unfamiliar with Corrie ten Boom and her story, I would definitely recommend looking it up. She has an autobiography called The Hiding Place, and it's very well known, and it's one of the most successful World War II autobiographies sold in the U.S. or something like that. But I read The Hiding Place. I've read The Hiding Place twice, but I haven't read it since high school, so it's been a very long time, like probably almost 15 years since I've read it, give or take. And so, although I know the story well, having read it twice since it's been so long, there were details I did not remember or did not remember correctly. But then reading it from a biography standpoint was a bit different, because Larry Loftis not only talks about Corrie ten Boom, but he talks about the people she interacted with and the people that she worked with, other members of the Dutch resistance that she may not have mentioned in her autobiography. He also talked about what else was going on at the time, and so he mentions Audrey Hepburn, who was going, if you know anything about Audrey Hepburn's history, you know that she was, that she lived through the Dutch occupation as a young child. She also helped a bit with the resistance as a young teenager, though she was kind of kept, since she was only 13 or 14, the resistance kept her kind of doing menial tasks, nothing too dangerous. They also talked about Anne Frank, who was a Jew during the Dutch occupation, and if you have heard of the Diary of Anne Frank, you know her story. And so it's really interesting, because I had heard all these stories separately, but to see them brought together in this biography, as well as other members of the resistance that were more close to Corrie ten Boom and the ten Boom family, it was kind of like reading The Hiding Place was seeing a very small portion of the picture, and then reading the biography was seeing a zoomed out, the bigger picture. But even more than that, even more than just the interesting aspects of seeing the bigger picture, it's Corrie ten Boom's story is just so inspiring. If you are unfamiliar with Corrie ten Boom's story, if you haven't read The Hiding Place or you've never heard of this biography, She and her family were Christian watchmakers in Amsterdam, in Haarlem, which is the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam, actually. They had a watch shop there, and they were one of the most renowned watch shops in Europe in the 1930s and 1940s. But they believed that the treatment of the Jews was wrong. And so when the occupation happened and when all of Hitler's laws, the Nazi laws, came into place, starting to round up Jews, even first starting with oppressing them before they even started rounding them up, the Tin Booms were against it. And when the roundup started happening, they started hiding Jews in their house, as well as doing other things for the Dutch resistance, which ultimately resulted in their family being arrested. And Corrie and her sister were sent to a concentration camp. They were sent to 2 different concentration camps. The second one was actually Ravensbrück, which those of you with Holocaust knowledge will know that was the infamous women's concentration camp that was known for its cruelty. And so her sister ended up dying in the concentration camp, but she ended up making it out. And just her faith in God through those very, very dark times is so inspiring. After making it out of the concentration camp, she ended up starting a home for people who had gone through concentration camps or other horrors of occupation and needed to recuperate before entering normal life again. She had a home for that. But she also had a home for displaced Germans. So that was interesting. And she ended up traveling from country to country and preaching the gospel and sharing her testimony and her story of forgiveness. Even in later life, she ended up meeting one of the guards from her concentration camp, her time in concentration camp, one of the German guards, who really regretted his own part in everything and asked her for her forgiveness. And she was able to give forgiveness to that man through the help of the Lord. And that is one fact that I have always remembered from the hiding place, her own testimony of how hard it was for her, you know, when he stuck out his hand and said, "You preach forgiveness, can you forgive me?" And she had to be like, in her mind, she was like, "Lord, you're going to have to forgive him through me because I can't do it on my own." And then she shook his hand and she was like, I felt it. I felt the Lord doing it for me. And it is just so inspiring to see not only her actions, but her whole family's actions through these dark times and their hope through the dark times. You know, her father was such a strong Christian and he preached Psalm 91 to them always, you know, hiding under the shelter of the Lord's wings. And like one of the young men that they hid in their home during the occupation, he was not a Jew, he was a young Dutchman, because, you know, the Germans, they rounded up all the young men in their occupied areas and sent them to German work camps, so for a lot of young men, they went into hiding so that they wouldn't have to go. So one of the young men that she hid, he came back like 30 years after the war, and he was able to write, because they had a guest book where all the people that they hid signed, and he was able to write in the guest book a verse in the Psalms that's basically thanking the Lord for the trouble that they've gone through because it's made them stronger. And he talked about, he was like, it was awful, but it brought us closer to the Lord. And so reading those testimonies and those stories in this biography, it really hit me, especially because in my church, we've been doing a series on preparing for the end times and the trials that the end times are going to bring. And the Bible says, like Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew, that the trials and tribulations of the end time are going to be like nothing that we've ever seen before. And so, you know, we have to lean on the Lord to prepare for that. And having that like sermon series go on while I read this book and read these people going through such a dark time and still being able to cling to the Lord, I found it so inspiring. So, yeah. And now I've gone on way too long about this, but I gave it 5 stars and it was so good and I would definitely recommend it. It's a hard read, obviously, because it's about people in occupied World War II and who end up in concentration camps and who go through so much hardship and starvation. And so you can tell it's going to be a hard read, but if you're up for it, I would definitely recommend it. Anyway, where am I? Next, I read All the Lost Places by Amanda Dykes. And this one was actually one that I started in like mid-December. And it took me a really long time to finish it. But I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars, but I have to kind of explain that a bit because it was a really slow start for me. And I've heard before that this book is really slow to begin with. And it was very slow for me. It was slow for me to get into. I had it from the library and I read probably over 100 pages into it, but then I had to return it to the library. So I returned it to the library, and then my mom and I were taking a driving trip, so I got it on audiobook to listen to in the car. I got it from the e-library on audiobook, so we listened to it on the way there and on the way back. And then when I got back, I got the ebook from the library so that I could finish it. So I read it on all 3 formats that you can. And I will say that by the end of the book, like, I flew through the last, like, third of the book because I was like, oh, I gotta know how it ends. And it was really, really good. And I really enjoyed it. I almost gave it 5 stars. And the only reason that I gave it 4 stars instead of 5 was because of the slow beginning. Because it took me forever to get into it. But once I finally did, I absolutely loved it. So the only reason it got 4 instead of 5 stars was because it was a really slow beginning. But if you don't mind slogging through a slow beginning, I would definitely recommend it because it was an excellent story. It is dual timeline, but like the first timeline, it's dual timeline, but the earlier timeline, it's like part timeline and part reading a book. It's hard to explain. So in the more modern timeline, which the more modern timeline is only 1911, so it's not too modern, but it's the modern timeline, the main character is translating a book called The Book of the Waters. That's his job, and he's trying to figure out how it ends because his manuscript doesn't have the ending, and so he's looking for the manuscript, the original manuscript that has the ending, so he can figure out how the story ends. So in the previous timeline, the earlier timeline, part of it is the Book of the Waters, which he's translating it, but part of it is the actual story. So yeah, it's interesting like that. But if you can get through a slow beginning, I would definitely recommend it. I did give it 4 stars. It was really good. So next I have the 3 picture books that I read. They're by Angela Henderson Smith. The first one is Isaac's Ice Cream Tree, and then Isaac and Izzy's Treehouse, and then Isaac and Izzy's Magical Maples. I gave all 3 of these 5 stars. I'm actually reviewing them for, because I'm part of a group that gets books from Wildfire Publishing every month to review, and January's month was these 3 picture books. I can't really say much about them. I mean, they're picture books. They're only about 20 pages each. They have really colorful illustrations that are really, really nice. They're cute stories. They're very light and fun, but I do think that each of them has like a unique message for kids to carry away. And probably the most important piece of information I could give you to encourage you with these books is that I think when I read the first one to my nieces and nephews, I've only read the first one to them so far, not the other 2, but when I read the first one to the nieces and nephews, which was Isaac's Ice Cream Tree, they seemed to really enjoy it. And even my nephew was like, I wish I had a tree like that. So yeah, they enjoyed it, which considering they're picture books for kids, I think that's saying a lot more than I could actually say for them. But yes, so those are those 3. And then the last book that I read in January was Laurel's Dream, which, like I said, this one actually comes before Heart of the Mountains, but I did not realize that, so I read them in reverse order, and I actually gave this one 5 stars. I only gave Heart of the Mountains 4 stars, and I gave this one 5. I can't really say too much about why, because in all honesty, they're very similar stories. They're each about a sibling. So, like I said in Heart of the Mountains, there is a young English woman who is writing to her brother, who is a missionary, teacher, doctor in the Appalachian Mountains. But this is his story. This is him coming from England to the Appalachian Mountains. He was only supposed to be there for a short time, but then he obviously falls in love with the people, with his work, with a woman, and he ends up staying. It just had a little more for me than Heart of the Mountains, so I gave it an extra 5 stars instead of just 4. But the stories are actually very, very similar, and maybe that's because it's like siblings with siblings, and it's also somebody coming from like really posh civilized England to like mountain Appalachia. So it's got the same kind of fish out of water, the same siblings they're falling in love with, the same characters, but yeah, they're very similar storylines. But I enjoyed them both very much. So I think that I hit up everything. I got everything, I think. So thank you very much for joining me, and I will see you in my next video.